Welcome back. We're going to be going now into ABC data collection. The reason why we want to take data on ABC is so that we can find out and identify the function or the why behind the behavior that we want to change. Typically, it's the behavior that we want to reduce, and usually it's what we call a maladaptive or problem behavior. Let's go into the parts of ABC. A stands for antecedent, which means what happens right before a behavior. B is for behavior, the behavior itself, and that's the behavior we want to decrease. And C is consequence, what happens right after the behavior. ABC recording is a way of collecting information to help determine exactly the function of a child's behavior. It does this by breaking down your observations into these three elements. In that case, A, B, C. So with antecedent, it's what we call a trigger, and it happens right before the behavior. There is always an antecedent. In this case, it could be a demand placed. That can trigger a behavior. So a demand is an antecedent. Another form of antecedent is transitioning, also stating to a learner no or having them wait. Also, denying access to an activity or a preferred item can trigger behavior, as well as withholding attention. These are all examples of antecedents, and they can trigger a behavior. So looking at this example here, we have in blue antecedents. So for example, when you hear your phone ringing, that is an antecedent. The behavior is you pick up the phone and answer. The second example is the waiter brings your food from the kitchen and serves it in front of you. The blue, again, is an antecedent, which then triggers the behavior of you taking a bite to eat. The last example is the traffic light turns green. That's the antecedent for you to drive and put the pedal to the metal. Now we're going to go into the second segment, which is called behaviors. So behavior is what we want to reduce. It's the exact behavior that we observe. In order for us to take data on the behaviors and to measure if the behaviors are in fact increasing or decreasing, we need to identify the behavior first. And the way to do this is we need to operationally define the behavior itself. For example, if the learner's maladaptive or problem behavior is, let's call it tantrum. So it could be something along the lines of any instance of falling to the floor, dropping to the floor, or refusing, protesting, crying with or without tears. So if the learner is observed exhibiting any of these behaviors, that is the operational definition, and that's our way for us to take data on that particular behavior. In other words, if a dead man can do this, it's the dead man's test, it is not a behavior. In this analogy, if a dead man is dead, that means they can't move. There's no actions or any form of behavior that's observable. So it's a good test for us to see if it's measurable for us to take data on. In this case, falling to the floor, dropping to the floor, crying with or without tears, that is observable. And that is in fact a behavior. So using this example for behavior, you see in blue, those are the behaviors. In black font is the antecedent. So you're sitting in the sun. In blue, the behavior is you put sunscreen on. Layla is running on the playground and falls. The behavior is she starts to cry. And lastly, your waiter places your drink in front of you. Your behavior is you pick it up to take a sip. So notice that these examples in blue are actually observable and measurable. Last but not least, consequences. So this happens after the behavior. So in this instance, after tantrum. Consequences occur right after the behavior. So for instance, a behavior that takes place, a consequence can either reinforce or decrease the behavior. In other words, what happens after the behavior will maintain the behavior through consequence. So an example of this would be, let's say the behavior is tantrum. And immediately when your learner tantrums, let's say the consequence is the parent gives attention. In this instance, the consequence is attention, and it will be maintained. That's the function. So every time the learner cries and tantrums, they know that they will get the attention from the parent. So we'll go into a little bit more examples in our demonstration segment, but typically consequences are what maintain a behavior. Antecedents are they help us identify the function of the behavior. Now let's take a quick quiz.